Hey guys, tonight we'll unveil the secret behind a murder without a blade, a historical event that occurred at the very dawn of the Tudor dynasty. Close your eyes and journey back to the year 1502, where a simple fever seized the power to determine the destiny of an entire nation. Prince Arthur, the highly anticipated future king, lay dying at the age of 15. His sudden passing was not just a heartbreak for his parents, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth, but a deadly power vacuum. It cast a major question mark over his budding political marriage to Catherine of Aragon, especially regarding the mystery that took place in the bridal chamber, which would later be challenged. More importantly, this death released Arthur's second brother, Henry, the Spare. Henry grew up under a colossal psychological burden, terrified of failure, and obsessed with fathering a son. This was the seed that blossomed into King Henry VIII, the man willing to use the axe and religious violence to secure his throne. Let's explore the tragedy that forced history to take such a devastating turn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me what time zone you are in and what the local time is right now. This is the perfect moment to begin. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. April the 2nd, in the year 1502, the dawn over Ludlow Castle was the colour of pewter cold, motionless, and heavy with breathless stillness. Inside one of its damp chambers, a boy of 15 lay dying. His body burned from within, fever consuming him as if his very blood had turned against itself. Sweat drenched his linen sheets, soaking through the fabric until it clung to his trembling skin. His breathing came in short, uneven gasps, the rhythm of someone whose body was forgetting how to live. Beside the bed knelt his wife, barely 16. Her hands were clasped, her lips whispering prayers in her mother tongue, Spanish the words trembling between faith and despair. 6 days earlier, the castle had been alive with music and laughter. The young prince had walked the corridors with an easy grace, discussing lessons with his tutors, exchanging small smiles with the servants, writing affectionate notes to his bride. Now, those same halls echoed with quiet footsteps and muffled sobs. No one dared to speak too loudly, as if sound itself could shatter the fragile line between life and death. The physicians had tried everything they knew, which in truth was little. Bloodletting, herbal infusions, charms whispered under their breath. Nothing worked. They wiped the sweat from his brow and told each other he was young, that youth itself might pull him through. But the fever only deepened. His pulse grew faint, his eyes unfocused. Every hour seemed to drag the world further from him, leaving only the flickering glow of candlelight and the faint scent of burning wax. The boy's name was Arthur Tudor, eldest son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the living symbol of peace after decades of bloodshed between Lancaster and York. He had been born to heal England's wounds, to stand as proof that war could give way to unity. His birth had been celebrated with church bells across London. His life, carefully guarded by the hopes of a nation that had bled itself dry in the Wars of the Roses. But now that promise was unravelling beneath the low ceiling of a damp chamber. The physicians could not name his sickness. Some whispered plague. Others called it the sweating sickness, a mysterious ailment that struck without warning, killing the strong and sparing the weak. A few murmured of poison or divine punishment. Yet none could answer the single, terrible question that hung over the room. What was killing the prince born to be king? Outside, Ludlow was silent. The spring wind carried a faint chill from the Welsh hills, rattling the shutters. Inside, time itself seemed to slow. Catherine of Aragon, his young wife, pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. She prayed in Latin now, her voice breaking on each word. Miserere nobis, Domine. Have mercy on us, O Lord. She could feel his heat through the cloth, a heat that was not life but fire. Only a week ago, Arthur had written to his parents, proudly describing his duties in the Council of Wales. He had sounded full of purpose, eager to prove himself worthy of the crown that awaited him. And now his body was betraying him in front of her eyes. The once bright future of England was shrinking to the size of a sick room, to the measured beat of a heart growing slower by the minute. The servants gathered outside the door, pale and whispering. Some crossed themselves. Others stared at the floor. They had served princes before, but this gentle boy, had smiled at them, had remembered their names. The castle itself seemed to mourn him. Every draught through the corridor felt like a sigh, every creak of wood like a lament. If he had lived, everything might have been different. There would have been no King Henry VIII, no 6 wives, no executions at the Tower, no break from Rome that would tear England apart. One illness, one twist of fate would rewrite 5 centuries of history. But fate, as it so often does, chose silence instead of mercy. As the night deepened, the last candle sputtered. The priests whispered the final prayers, the Latin words blurring into the rhythm of rain against the stone. Catherine's eyes were red, her voice hoarse, her hands trembling. She could do nothing now but watch and wait. Somewhere in the grey light before dawn, the boy who was meant to be king took one final breath. The castle exhaled with him. A crown's future vanished. In his place, a shadow began to stir the seed of obsession that would grow inside his younger brother, Henry, the boy who watched from afar and would one day demand what fate had denied, an heir at any cost. And so, on that cold morning of April the 2nd, in the year 1502, England's history shifted in silence. A single death, quiet, unseen by the world beyond Ludlow's walls, began the slow unravelling of everything that was meant to be saved. The candles went out, leaving only the faint smell of smoke, and the whispered prayer of a 16-year-old widow, hanging in the air like a fading echo. "Please, God, don't take him." Heaven sue. Before Arthur Tudor drew his first breath, England had bled itself dry beneath 2 banners, one red, one white, the emblems of Lancaster and York. The long and merciless conflict known as the Wars of the Roses had turned meadows into graveyards and brothers into enemies. Fathers had watched sons die on muddy fields, and oaths of loyalty had changed hands like coins passed in a storm. For 3 decades, the kingdom had been torn between rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, both claiming divine right to the same fragile throne. Then, in the heat of August in the year 1485, destiny took an unexpected turn. On the field of Bosworth, a man named Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a frail claim to royalty, faced the reigning Yorkist monarch, King Richard III. The 2 armies collided in chaos, steel against steel, mud against blood. Richard, desperate to end the rebellion with one swift stroke, spurred his horse toward Henry himself, sword raised high, the act of a king who would kill or die for his crown. He did not reach him. In a single violent instant, the fate of England shifted. Richard fell, and with him fell the House of York. Henry Tudor, against all expectation, emerged victorious. He was crowned King Henry VII upon the battlefield, his crown plucked from the dead king's head and placed upon his own. But victory did not bring peace. The land beneath his feet was cracked and weary. England was exhausted, its nobility decimated, its coffers empty, its people distrustful. The throne had changed hands so many times that no one believed it would stay steady for long, not even the man who now sat upon it. Henry knew his claim was fragile. Whispers followed him through the corridors of Westminster like shadows. The blood he carried was legitimate only through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a Lancastrian by descent, but one whose line had long been doubted. Every noble family in England watched him, calculating whether he would last a year, a month, a week. Henry understood that power built on conquest could crumble overnight. To mend the wounds of war, he needed not more battles, but a union, a symbol to convince both sides that the bloodshed was finally over. So he sought a bride not for love, but for survival. His choice was Elizabeth of York, niece of the slain King Richard and daughter of Edward IV, a woman who embodied the rival claim to the throne. She was also the sister of the 2 vanished princes from the Tower, whose mysterious disappearance had haunted England's conscience. Their marriage, celebrated in January of 1486, was not only political, it was essential. When Elizabeth conceived soon after the wedding, the entire realm seemed to exhale. Bells rang across London, bonfires lit the winter streets, and for the first time in years, the word hope felt safe to speak aloud. That hope took flesh on a September morning of the same year. The child was strong, healthy, and royal in every line of his blood. He was named Arthur, after the legendary king whose name had once united the Isles. The choice was deliberate. a myth reborn, a prophecy renewed. The people whispered that this boy would heal England, that the cycle of blood and betrayal would end with him. Arthur's early years were a tapestry of ritual and expectation. At the age of 3, he was made a Knight of the Bath, an ancient ceremony involving purification baths, night-long vigils, and sacred oaths. While most children still stumbled through their first lessons in speech, he was already dressed in miniature armour and taught to bow before the altar of destiny. Titles followed him like a procession of prayers. Duke of Cornwall, Prince of Wales, Earl of Chester. Each name carried centuries of history and the weight of a kingdom's longing. On festival days, he was paraded along the River Thames aboard the royal barge, a tiny figure in gilded plate armour, sunlight flashing across his sword as Londoners lined the banks to cheer. They called him the boy who would save England. For once, the realm believed it. In a nursery not far away, another child was growing, Henry, born in the year 1491. He was the spare, the second son, the insurance policy of a dynasty still uncertain of its own survival. From the beginning, the brothers' paths diverged. Arthur's days were filled with tutors and theology, Latin and logic, the measured lessons of kingship. Henry's were louder, riding lessons, swordplay, the clamour of jousting fields. Arthur studied diplomacy. Henry learned how to conquer boredom. Yet for all their differences, the two boys were close. They played together in the palace gardens, laughed over small mischiefs, and grew up in the golden light of their parents' cautious optimism. Still, everyone who looked upon them knew the truth. Only one would inherit the crown. Only one would carry the future. Arthur was the chosen heir, polished and prepared, the living embodiment of peace after war. Henry was merely his reflection, a shadow trailing behind. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of the nursery where the two slept, fate was already watching, measuring, waiting, ready to decide which of them would rise and which would fall. In those early years, no one could have imagined that the balance would break so soon. Yet history, like the blood of England itself, has always preferred tragedy to symmetry. Arthur Tudor grew beneath the quiet weight of expectation. From the earliest years, his education was a careful construction. Each lesson, each word, each ritual, placed like marble along the path that led toward the crown. His tutors were the finest minds from the universities of Paris and Oxford, men steeped in Latin, French, history, and philosophy. Under their guidance, the young prince's mind opened like a polished book. He spoke Latin fluently, not as a student parroting grammar, but as a thinker who could debate theology and statecraft with a maturity beyond his age. In his studies, he arranged the reigns of England's kings in memory, as neatly as a choir arranges verses of a hymn. Physically, he was tall and slender for his years, graceful in movement, deliberate in speech. At court, when music drifted through the great hall, Arthur could dance with a composure that made courtiers pause to watch. He carried himself not like a boy, but like a figure already shaped by destiny. His hair gleamed red gold, the same hue as his maternal grandfather, King Edward IV. His eyes, though small, were luminous, and his manner gentle, so gentle that one observer described him as the most loving and true prince that ever lived. His voice was calm, measured, and soft enough that one had to lean in to hear him, a habit that made his words sound more precious than they were. But intellect and grace alone could not secure England's position in Europe. The realm was still young under the Tudor banner, and its legitimacy fragile. What England needed was an alliance, one that would make the rest of Europe bow its head in recognition. Across the sea, a new power had risen. In Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united their kingdoms through marriage, driven out the last Moorish forces from Granada, and begun building a vast empire that reached beyond the horizon. Their court glittered with wealth, faith, and ambition. Among their children was a daughter named Catherine, born in December of the year 1485, only 3 months after Arthur. King Henry VII saw in her the perfect bridge, a union between England and Spain that would secure his throne, legitimize his dynasty, and stand as a warning to France, whose kings still eyed the English coast with envy. But diplomacy, like history, moves slowly. The Spanish envoys were cautious. They questioned whether the Tudor line, new and untested, could endure. Would Henry's crown last? Or would England tumble again into civil war as it had so many times before? For years, negotiations wound through chambers scented with ink and candle smoke. Every detail, the dowry, the treaty, the guarantees of peace was debated and redrafted. At last, in the summer of 1497, when Arthur was 10 years old, the betrothal was formally agreed. The contract was signed, sealed, and celebrated across both realms. To the people of England, it was proof that their young dynasty was no longer an island. It was a partner in the great game of Europe. 2 years later, the marriage was carried out by proxy, a legal ceremony in which representatives stood in for the bride and groom. Arthur, still too young to meet his bride, was represented by a nobleman who clasped Catherine's hand in his stead. From that moment they were husband and wife in the eyes of God and kings, though they had never seen one another. Then began the letters written in Latin, the shared language of learning and diplomacy. In his first, Arthur confessed his joy at their union, calling himself the happiest of princes, and expressing the hope that God would grant him the chance to serve and honour her in person. Catherine, raised under the strict discipline of her mother Isabella, replied with words of warmth and respect. Beneath the formality of their lines, something tender began to stir the faint glow of affection between two children, bound together by politics. While Arthur's days were filled with studies and ceremonies, his younger brother Henry, the boy born in the year 1491, lived a different rhythm. Where Arthur studied Cicero, Henry learned to ride, to hunt, to swing a sword. While Arthur discussed philosophy, Henry practiced jousting in the yard, laughing as he shattered lances against the targets. To one brother, destiny was a burden polished to perfection. To the other, it was an absence that gave him freedom. And yet, that difference, that imbalance of expectation began to form an invisible pressure. Everyone in court looked to Arthur, the golden heir, the promise of stability. Henry was the spare, the echo that waited in silence. But children grow beneath the gaze of others, and even silence has a way of leaving marks. As the decade turned, the alliance with Spain seemed to glitter like a new dawn. The Tudors had secured their place among the thrones of Europe. The boy Prince of England and the girl Princess of Spain were destined to unite two kingdoms through marriage, faith, and youth. No one yet knew that this carefully woven thread of diplomacy would, in time, become the knot that strangled both love and empire. For now, in the stillness of the English court, Arthur studied his books by candlelight, and Catherine, across the sea in Granada, practiced her Latin prayers, two young lives tracing the same line of fate toward a meeting that would shape the destiny of a continent. In October of the year 1501, after months of storms, delays, and seasickness, Catherine of Aragon finally set foot on English soil. She was 16 years old, a princess of Spain, raised under the iron faith of Queen Isabella, schooled in languages, music, and duty. The journey from her homeland had been perilous. Rough waters through the Bay of Biscay, rain-lashed ports, and nights so cold her attendants wrapped her in furs by candlelight. Yet, when the English shore appeared at last, it seemed for a moment like the promise of a new world. She was to meet her husband, the boy who had written her letters in careful Latin, calling her carissima sponsa, my dearest bride. He was 15, fair-haired and pale, waiting at Dogmersfield in Hampshire. When their eyes met for the first time, chroniclers wrote that Arthur Tudor greeted her with warmth and reverence, promising that he would be a loving and true husband. For two children raised in ceremony, the encounter was gentle, uncertain, and brief, a ritual greeting between two nations disguised as a meeting between a boy and a girl. On the 14th of November, they were married at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself performed the ceremony, while nobles from across Europe watched beneath a forest of banners. The celebration lasted for days. Banquets, processions, tournaments. The city rejoiced, and bells rang across the Thames, their sound rolling over the rooftops like waves. That night, the Bishop of London blessed their marriage bed before the eyes of witnesses, as tradition demanded. Then, the doors were closed, and England exhaled, unaware that within those walls lay the seed of one of history's great questions. Did they consummate the marriage? That single uncertainty, what happened, or did not happen, in the quiet of that room, would one day divide a kingdom and tear the church in two. But for now, The question was only a whisper. The newlyweds spent their first month at Tickenhill Manor in Worcestershire, surrounded by their household staff, letters from Spain, and a cautious happiness. Arthur attended his lessons in governance, and Catherine began to learn English customs, how to address nobles, how to dine, how to kneel at Mass in the English way. In December, the couple travelled to Ludlow Castle, a grey fortress perched near the Welsh border. It was here that Arthur, Prince of Wales, was to preside over the Council of Wales and the Marches, his first true test as heir to the throne. Within the stone walls of Ludlow, life found a rhythm. Servants bustled through cold corridors carrying trays of wine and letters sealed with wax. Catherine wrote regularly to her parents, describing her husband as kind and intelligent, though often weary from his duties. Arthur attended council meetings, discussed land disputes, and studied statecraft beneath the portraits of kings long dead. Together, they created a small household meals shared, prayers whispered, evenings spent listening to music or reading aloud. For 3 months, it seemed a life had begun to take root. Yet beneath the calm, something was changing. Catherine noticed first. Her husband's laughter came less easily. He tired quickly after walking the courtyard. Sometimes, his hands trembled when he lifted a cup. The servants saw it too, but said nothing. He was 15, still growing, still learning. Perhaps it was only fatigue. Arthur himself brushed it aside. He continued to work, to ride, to smile. The prince, who was meant to embody strength, could not afford to appear frail. Then March came, bringing more than spring. A sickness crept through Ludlow town. Some called it the plague. Others blamed corrupt airs. Invisible poisons carried on the wind. People fell ill suddenly. A fever that scorched from within. A sweat that drenched the body in minutes. They called it the sweating sickness. On the 27th of March, Arthur collapsed. His skin burned, his pulse raced, his breath came in gasps. That same day, Catherine too fell ill. Their attendants hurriedly sealed off their chamber to prevent contagion. Physicians entered one after another, royal men of science, armed with vials of herbs and leeches, with whispered prayers and blind hope. They prescribed rest, bloodletting and potions brewed from rosemary and vinegar. None of it helped. The disease moved faster than thought. Within minutes, the victims' clothing soaked through with sweat, their skin flushed red, their hearts hammered in their chests. Then came delirium, confusion, fevered dreams, faces of loved ones turning to shadows. Many died within 24 hours. The servants began to pray aloud in the corridors. Inside the room, Catherine fought to stay conscious. Her fever rose and fell, and for days she hovered between waking and dream, her hands trembling in the candlelight. Somehow, slowly, her young body began to resist the illness. Arthur's did not. The physicians could only watch as the heir to England weakened. His skin turned pale, his lips cracked. The fever raged, and sweat poured from him until even the sheets beneath him were soaked. Every prayer, every charm, every desperate attempt to cool his burning skin failed. One chronicler later wrote that the deadly corruption did utterly vanquish and overcome the pure and friendly blood. No medicine could stop it. No prayer could reverse it. Ludlow's bells were silent now. Outside, the rain returned, tapping against the narrow windows as if keeping count of his breaths. Within the castle, time dissolved into the slow rhythm of despair, the scraping of chairs, the soft step of servants bringing water, the whisper of Catherine's voice, too weak to pray. In those final days of March, England itself seemed to hold its breath. The boy who was meant to heal the nation's wounds lay dying, his crown still only a promise. And beside him, the girl from Spain, now widowed in all but name, clutched his hand and waited for the dawn that would never come. Catherine of Aragon, through youth and endurance, began to recover. Her body, though shaken and fevered, slowly found its rhythm again. Arthur's did not. Day after day, the royal physicians worked in vain, each remedy more desperate than the last. They drew his blood to release the corrupt vapours. They purged his body with bitter herbs to restore the balance of the four humours. They burned incense to cleanse the air, ground roots into paste, and prayed in Latin beneath flickering candlelight. Monks whispered psalms from the Psalter, as if the rhythm of their voices might call him back. Yet nothing availed. The unseen rot, the deadly corruption, as one contemporary would write, crept through him like black water, spreading through clear glass, slowly vanquishing and overcoming the pure and friendly blood. By dawn on the 2nd of April, in the year 1502, the sky over Ludlow Castle had turned a colourless grey. The wind pressed softly against the shutters. Inside, the room was silent except for the faint rasp of breath that came slower and slower until it stopped. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, heir to England's throne, was dead. He was 15 years old. His marriage had lasted less than half a year. The stillness did not last. Within hours, the court at Ludlow stirred with grim purpose. Messengers were called, horses saddled. The king had to be told. Wrapped in black cloaks, riders galloped through the wet dawn, hooves striking mud and stone, carrying the news toward Greenwich Palace, where King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York were staying. They reached the palace late on a Monday night. The king was asleep, but the servants dared not wake him directly. Instead, they roused his confessor, a priest named John Fisher, who rose quietly, dressed, and prayed before entering the king's chamber at first light. Henry dismissed his attendants. The priest opened his Bible and recited softly in Latin, "Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" The words hung in the cold air for a moment. Henry understood. "Your dearest son," the priest said, "has departed to God." The king did not speak. The weight of those words settled like stone in his chest. This was not merely the death of a child, it was the breaking of a promise. Arthur had been the living bond that sealed the peace between Lancaster and York, the proof that the long War of Roses had ended. Without him, the Tudor dynasty trembled again on uncertain ground. Henry sent for the Queen. When Elizabeth of York entered and saw her husband's face, she knew. Yet she stood straight, composed, her grief folded neatly behind her words. In a calm voice she said, "Remember your own life. Remember your realm needs you. God preserved you when you were alone. When your mother had but one son new, God has brought you to this throne. We still have Prince Henry, strong and healthy, and our 2 daughters, fair and kind. We are both young enough to hope for more." Her words were meant to steady him, and they did. Henry drew strength from her composure, from the faith she wrapped around their loss. But when she left the room, closing the door softly behind her, the strength dissolved. In her private chambers, Elizabeth collapsed in grief. The Queen's ladies panicked and sent for the king. Henry ran to her, and together they wept not as monarchs but as parents who had lost their firstborn child. Far away, in Ludlow, the rituals of death had begun. According to custom, the prince's body could not simply remain in bed. The royal physicians, following medieval practice, removed the internal organs to preserve the flesh for transport. The body cavity was filled with spices, cinnamon, cloves, frankincense, costly offerings meant to slow decay and mask the smell of death. Then the body was wrapped in linen and placed within a wooden chest. The chest was covered in black cloth marked with a white cross. Arthur was moved to a chamber prepared for mourning. Its walls hung with gold damask drapery, the air heavy with wax and spice. Upon a table, beneath a canopy of velvet, his coffin rested. 4 tall candles stood at the corners, burning without pause, their light bending in the cold draught that crept through the stone walls. Silver candlesticks gleamed like frozen tears. For 3 weeks, the body remained there, while courtiers planned the funeral and debated how to honour the boy who had never worn the crown. Meanwhile, in Greenwich, a different transformation was taking place. A child of 10 years old, Prince Henry, suddenly found the weight of England placed upon his narrow shoulders. The spare had become the heir. No one spoke of it to his face. But everyone around him changed, the tutors who now bowed more deeply, the servants who watched him as though he might break. Even as they mourned, the machinery of monarchy shifted toward him. He understood more than he was told. In that moment, a quiet seed was planted, the knowledge that one fragile breath could decide the fate of a dynasty. That seed would grow through his youth, through his manhood, and through the long, violent reign that would follow. It would harden into obsession with heirs, with bloodlines, with control. And so, on the grey morning of April the 2nd, as the bells of Ludlow tolled and wax dripped slowly onto the golden cloth beside a boy's coffin, the story of one prince ended and the shadow of another began to rise. On the 23rd of April, in the year 1502, the feast day of St. George, the patron saint of England, should have been filled with banners and bells, with parades and voices raised in praise of valour. Instead, it became a dirge that drifted through the kingdom, a day when every note of joy turned to mourning. From the great hall of Ludlow Castle, the coffin of Prince Arthur Tudor was lifted by hands gloved in black and gold, the colours of royal service. The chest was draped in dark cloth embroidered with a white cross, its stark simplicity more solemn than any jewel. At its head, bishops swung censers heavy with frankincense, cinnamon, and clove, their smoke curling into the cold air, mingling with the breath of the mourners. The scent clung to the stone walls, as though trying to hold on to the warmth that had fled with the young prince's life. By the law and custom of the crown, no member of the royal family was permitted to attend the funeral. It was an old superstition to keep the throne untouched by the shadow of death. Yet this tradition, meant to protect, left an aching emptiness beside the coffin. Where a father's hand or a mother's tear might have rested, there was only silence. That silence was filled by two figures. Behind the bier walked two Spanish noblemen, envoys from the household of Catherine of Aragon, representing the grief of the 16-year-old widow who lay recovering in her chamber. They moved slowly, their black cloaks trailing on the flagstones, their faces hidden beneath hoods. To the watching crowd, they were more than men. They were symbols of two nations joined by sorrow. Inside St. Lawrence's Church at Ludlow, the requiem began. For 3 days and nights, priests chanted the psalms of the dead. The nave glowed with the light of towering candles, taller than a man, their flames trembling each time the heavy doors opened to admit another mourner. The air was thick with wax and smoke, with the steady murmur of prayers in Latin. Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domini grant him eternal rest, O Lord. Outside, the poor gathered in the courtyard. The king's stewards distributed alms and bread, a royal act of mercy meant both to honour the dead and to comfort the living. Each coin pressed into a beggar's hand was a reminder that grief, like charity, belonged to all. In giving to the poor, the court hoped to knit together a nation suddenly uncertain of its future, to turn private tragedy into a public act of compassion. Within the church, the organ breathed faintly, its notes slow and hollow. The priests read aloud Arthur's titles one by one: Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester. Each name echoed like the falling of autumn leaves, honours that now hung over a life that had barely begun. Some said that his heart, or perhaps the organs removed during embalming, were buried beneath the stone floor of St. Lawrence's. Whether true or not, pilgrims would later come to kneel there, leaving small coins and whispered prayers. For the people of Ludlow, it became a place where grief could take form, a fixed point of mourning for a boy who had promised to unite a nation and had instead departed before his crown was ever placed. As the Mass ended, the church fell still. Only the candles remained alive, flickering against the high arches like faint souls reluctant to depart. The clergy began to close the service with verses from the book of Job, words that had comforted kings before and would comfort them again. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Outside, spring pressed against the earth. The grass was damp with dew, the wind soft and restless. Bells tolled across the fields, their rhythm measured, their tone low. Farmers paused in their ploughing, women bowed their heads at market stalls, and children were hushed by their mothers. The whole realm seemed to exhale in sorrow. For the courtiers who stood beneath the banners, this was not only the burial of a prince, it was the burial of certainty. The Tudor peace, so newly forged, now trembled again. And yet the ceremony went on with perfect order, every ritual observed, every candle lit exactly as prescribed. Even grief, in the Tudor court, had a hierarchy. As the final prayer faded, the clergy processed slowly down the aisle, their voices echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The coffin remained at the altar, surrounded by gold cloth and burning wax. Later, the heart, or what was said to be the heart, would rest forever within St. Lawrence's. The body itself, however, would travel farther still. For now, though, the people of Ludlow left the church in silence. Behind them, the wind swept through the open doorway, carrying with it the faint scent of incense and the distant sound of bells. The Latin pages of the scriptures turned softly on the lectern, as though some unseen hand were closing the book of one life and preparing to open another. And so ended the morning at Ludlow, a prince carried to prayer by strangers, a kingdom bound by loss, and a day that should have been a feast transformed forever into a lamentation whispered in candlelight. From Ludlow to Worcester was no great distance, barely 30 miles yet on that April day. The journey stretched like a century. What might have been a short passage across the English countryside became instead a slow pilgrimage through grief and storm, a procession so heavy that each mile seemed to bend beneath it. The coffin of Prince Arthur Tudor was set upon what the records simply call a chair, likely a chariot, like beer, a wheeled carriage built for royal funerals. It was drawn by 6 black horses, their manes slick with rain, their harnesses draped in thick cloth the colour of midnight. Both horses and carriage were shrouded in black from head to hoof, so that the entire cortege looked like a cloud brought low to earth, dragging its shadow through the mud. Then, as though the heavens themselves objected to letting the young prince go, the weather broke. Rain began to fall not gently, but in sheets, driven slantwise by a bitter north wind. The air turned raw and sharp, slicing through the leather gloves of those who walked behind. Mud rose over their boots. Wheels sank into the sucking earth. The path that wound through the countryside dissolved into trenches of mire. The 6 horses strained, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hooves churning the soil into brown water. Soon, they could pull no more. The procession halted. The attendants, soaked and silent, called for help from the nearby farms. Oxen were brought, heavy, broad-shouldered beasts with patient eyes, breathing clouds into the rain. Harnessed alongside the horses, they heaved with all their strength to move what one chronicler later called a prince without weight. And yet the coffin, laden with wood, cloth and sorrow, seemed impossibly heavy, as though grief itself had mass. The mourners followed on foot. Earls, knights and servants all trudged through the storm. The water ran down their faces, into their collars, along their legs. Their cloaks, once fine, clung wetly to their calves, and each step made a sound, a slow, sucking rhythm that echoed between the hills like a drumbeat for the dead. Someone, we do not know his name, later wrote of that day, "It was the foulest, coldest, windiest and rainiest day that ever I have seen." The line remains in the records, simple and unadorned, but when read aloud it feels like a candle guttering in the dark. The testimony of a witness who understood that even nature, that day, bowed its head in mourning. Along the roadside, villagers watched in silence. Some crossed themselves, others knelt in the mud. They did not see a royal procession. They saw a child, barely 15, carried toward eternity. And as the cortege passed, the smoke of their hearths mixed with the falling rain, making a low mist that clung to the horses' legs. Hours passed. The rain did not stop. The candles within the glass lanterns dimmed. Banners hung limp. Men stumbled, caught their balance, and continued without complaint. The storm had become part of the ceremony, a chant of wind and water, a psalm without words. Each footstep sank and rose again, as though the earth itself resisted giving up its prince. The road between Ludlow and Worcester was lined with bare trees, their branches black and dripping. The mourners moved beneath them like a shadowed river. At times the rain struck so hard that faces disappeared behind veils of water. At others, the wind lifted the cloaks of the attendants, turning them briefly into sails of mourning. And yet, there was order even in the misery. The heralds kept pace. The clergy whispered prayers between gusts of wind. The bells from distant villages answered faintly through the storm. It was as if the kingdom itself was walking, step by step, behind the coffin of its heir. At last, through the grey haze, the spires of Worcester Cathedral appeared distant at first, then slowly taking shape. The high towers, the arched windows, the promise of shelter. The rain began to ease. The wind softened. The sound of hooves and wheels grew clearer, no longer drowned by thunder or gust. The people who walked behind felt their throats tighten. The relief of nearing the end mixed with something else, an ache that had no name. For 3 days they had carried a symbol of England's hope, and now that hope was to be laid down forever. The storm's passing only made the emptiness sharper, like silence after a hymn. As the cortege entered the city, townsfolk lined the streets, their heads uncovered despite the drizzle. They bowed as the coffin passed, not from obligation but from understanding. The air was damp and cold, but there was a strange peace in it, the calm that comes when grief has spent all its strength. By the time the mourners reached the cathedral gates, the last drops of rain slid quietly from the eaves. The wind fell still. Some said later that the very weather had changed to honour him, that the heavens had wept until the journey was complete. Those who had walked the full 30 miles would never forget that day, not because of the ceremony, nor the gold cloth that covered the coffin, but because of what the road itself had become. A moving requiem, a prayer of mud and breath, a slow unwinding of hope. When the gates of Worcester closed behind them, they knew they had witnessed something more than a funeral. They had walked, quite literally, through the passing of an age, from the promise of one boy to the uncertain dawn of another. And in the silence that followed, the sound that lingered longest was not the tolling of bells, but the memory of rain. Inside Worcester Cathedral, the air was cool and heavy with incense. Light from the stained glass windows filtered through the morning haze, falling in fractured patches across the black-draped coffin, reds, blues, and golds trembling like broken pieces of a forgotten crown. The sound of footsteps faded to silence. Only the low murmur of prayer and the faint crackle of candles remained. At the head of the open vault stood John Blythe, Bishop of Lincoln, his vestments dark beneath the shifting colours of the glass. When he lifted his hand to sprinkle holy water over the coffin, his shoulders trembled. The drops struck the wood softly, each one a glimmering mark of farewell. Then came the sound, a short, unguarded sob that escaped from him before he could swallow it down. Around the grave, those who had served the prince gathered: officers, stewards, knights, and ushers, men who had known Arthur from his first awkward riding lessons to his days presiding over the council at Ludlow. They stood still, their faces drawn, their breaths shallow in the cold cathedral air. Each knew what was about to happen, the ancient rite that ended a royal household, the breaking of the staffs. First stepped forward Sir William Audley, comptroller of the prince's household. His black-gloved hands gripped the polished staff of office, the symbol of service, of loyalty sworn to a living master. Slowly he raised it high above his head. For a moment it caught the light like a slender cross, and then, with a quick motion, he broke it cleanly in two. The sound, a sharp, wooden crack, echoed off the stone walls. He let the pieces fall into the open grave. Next came Sir Richard Croft, steward of the household. He did the same. The wood splintered under his strength, and the two halves clattered softly against the coffin lid. One by one the other officers followed. The gentlemen ushers, the chamberlains, each snapping his staff and casting it down. The fragments gathered like the remains of a small forest at the bottom of the grave, a tangle of symbols, each one representing duty severed by death. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the weight of ritual, the visible surrender of loyalty to a life now ended. The choir began to chant the words of the Miserere, the plea for mercy that has followed kings and beggars alike into eternity. Their voices rose and fell, low and trembling, weaving through the echo of the breaking wood. Then came the sound of earth. The first shovelful fell slowly, scattering over the coffin's surface like soft rain. Another followed, and another. Each scoop was deliberate, measured, as though the weight of the soil were measured in meaning rather than mass. To those who watched, each grain felt heavy, the physical closing of a story that had barely begun. Around the grave, the mourners bowed their heads. The Latin prayers continued requiescat in pace. Filius Regis, may the king's son rest in peace. The bishop's voice grew hoarse as he read the final blessing. When the last words faded, only the sound of earth remained. Somewhere in the stillness, the details of a life began to echo in the minds of those present, unspoken, yet as clear as the tolling bells outside. Born in September of the year 1486. Died on the 2nd of April, 1502. Married less than half a year. Aged 15. The numbers, recited in thought rather than speech, took on the shape of a life too short to bear its own importance. When the final layer of soil was levelled and the cross set upon it, the officers stepped back. The torches burned lower. The cathedral smelled of wax, wet stone, and grief. No one spoke as the choir's final notes dissolved into silence. Yet the silence was not empty. Beneath it ran a deeper question, one that every man in that chamber carried unspoken. What now? What would become of England without its firstborn hope? The Wars of the Roses had ended less than 2 decades before. The peace between Lancaster and York had been sealed by Arthur's birth. And now, that fragile thread had snapped. The bishop closed his book. The pallbearers lifted their heads. One by one, the mourners turned away from the grave, their footsteps hollow on the stones. Some glanced back at the altar, where sunlight fell across the new mound, as if light itself were reluctant to leave him. Outside, the bells began to toll once more, their rhythm slow and deep. Beyond the cathedral doors, the city of Worcester stood hushed. Shopkeepers paused mid-gesture. Children clutched their mothers' hands. A prince had been buried, and with him a chapter of England's promise. But history, as ever, was already shifting. In Greenwich, a 10-year-old boy, Prince Henry, had become heir to everything his brother had left unfinished. The courtiers who watched the burial did not know it, but the weight that had been lowered into the ground that morning would rise again, not as innocence, but as obsession. The bishop's hands folded. The final candle was extinguished. The door hinges gave a soft sigh as the great wooden doors swung shut. Worcester kept its secret. The tomb was sealed, the prayers completed. But beyond those stone walls, in palaces and corridors still dim with mourning, the kingdom had already begun to change quietly, inexorably along a path that no one yet dared to name. The words spoken by Elizabeth of York on the day she comforted her husband were not merely words of solace, they were a vow. When she told Henry VII that they were both young enough to hope again, she meant it. In the quiet that followed their son's burial, the Queen made a final act of faith in the future of her line. A few weeks after Prince Arthur's death, the palace began to whisper that the Queen was with child once more. Elizabeth was 36 years old, an age already considered late for childbirth in Tudor England, where most noble women bore their last children before 30. Yet she carried the hope of a kingdom in her womb. The courtiers moved softly through the chambers, speaking in low tones. Even the servants crossed themselves when they passed her door. For to them, this pregnancy was not simply personal, it was a chance to heal history, to close the wound left by Arthur's death. Winter thickened over Greenwich Palace. Fires burned day and night in the royal apartments, their smoke curling up the tapestries embroidered with the Tudor rose. The Queen, pale but calm, spent her confinement in prayer and quiet work with her ladies. The midwives prepared linens, the nurses whispered of omens, some said they had dreamed of lilies, others of white doves. All waited for the child who might secure the future. On the morning of the 11th of February, 1503, as the bells of Greenwich tolled for her 37th birthday, Elizabeth went into labour. Snow lay heavy outside the windows. For hours the palace echoed with footsteps and muted voices. Then, near midday, the sound of an infant's cry broke through the hush. A girl. The child was named Catherine, a name chosen with quiet symbolism, linking her to Catherine of Aragon, the widowed princess whose very presence still tied England to Spain. Some saw it as a gesture of reconciliation, others as an offering, a way of binding the living to the dead. But joy in Tudor courts was fragile, and fate never lingered long in mercy. Within hours, the Queen grew weak. The bleeding did not stop. Fever followed. The midwives sent for the royal physicians, but their tinctures and prayers availed nothing. The court fell into fearful silence, the corridors filled with the scent of herbs and candle wax. For 9 days, Elizabeth hovered between life and death. On the 19th of February, her struggle ended. Elizabeth of York, Queen Consort of England, daughter of Edward IV, mother of the Tudor dynasty, was dead aged 37. The newborn Catherine survived her only a few days. By the end of the month, both mother and child were gone. The news struck Henry VII like a blow to the soul. In less than a year he had lost his heir, his wife, and the fragile sense of security that had steadied his rule. Witnesses recorded that when he learned of her death, he shut himself away in his private chamber for 2 days, refusing food, comfort, or counsel. Those who waited outside heard no sound except the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing the floor. When he finally emerged, the man who stepped out was changed. Once a cautious monarch, Henry became something harder, sharper, more watchful. Grief twisted into vigilance. Vigilance hardened into control. He began to see danger everywhere in his nobles, in his subjects, even in his own court. He turned inward, toward the only two things he could still command: money and order. The royal treasury, once a tool of governance, became a fortress. He hoarded gold not out of greed, but out of fear, as if coins could guard him from loss. The council learned in the law, under men like Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, enforced fines and bonds that spread through England like a net. Justice became calculation. Mercy became risk. Henry's policies grew colder, his trust rarer, his peace of mind unreachable. What had begun as sorrow became a system. In the quiet corridors of the palace, life continued but differently. Servants spoke of the king's long silences, of letters burned, of ledgers checked twice. And in one of the upper chambers, a boy of 10 years old, Prince Henry, learned what had changed. He had once been the spare, the second son, lively, laughing, loved without the burden of expectation. Now every glance turned toward him carried the weight of a crown. The lessons of music, dance, and Latin continued, but beneath them grew a new kind of schooling, the art of stillness, of caution, of performance. He learned how to stand before seasoned courtiers without trembling, how to bow with dignity before men twice his age, how to measure his words before they left his lips. Each day brought a small erasure of childhood. The games in the tilt-yard grew quieter, the laughter rarer. When he practiced the lute, his tutor said he played as though counting time. Even his pleasures, jousting, riding, reading, seemed shadowed by the echo of his brother's absence. Somewhere inside him, a truth took root, that the crown he might one day wear had been bought by death. The storm that had shaken England appeared to have passed, but cracks remained, hairline fractures beneath the polished surface of Tudor triumph. In those fissures, something darker began to grow, an unease that would later harden into obsession. Years later, when Henry would become king, that same unease would bloom into the question that would haunt him for decades. The hunger for heirs, the terror of losing them, the conviction that fate itself could be mastered by will. And though no one in Greenwich could know it then, that fear had already begun to whisper, faint as breath, steady as a heartbeat beneath the silence of the widowed king, and the solemn steps of a boy who would one day be called Henry VIII. When Henry VIII reached manhood, the memory of loss, a kingdom that had buried its firstborn, its queen, and nearly its stability, did not fade. It threaded through his life like a red cord, unseen but unbreakable, binding his every decision to a fear older than himself. The shadow of Arthur Tudor, the brother who had died at 15, lingered behind every candlelit prayer, every royal decree, every cradle that fell silent. In the early years of his reign, Henry appeared radiant, tall, athletic, learned, the very image of a Renaissance prince. But behind that brilliance lay a dread inherited from the cold halls of Ludlow and Worcester. Each time Catherine of Aragon, his queen and Arthur's widow, conceived, the court dared to hope. Each time she miscarried or delivered a stillborn child, that hope collapsed like a cathedral roof in an earthquake. The king's grief was not only for the unborn, it was for the brother whose face he saw in dreams, the echo of funeral bells that had tolled long before his crown. He had once called Catherine the only woman he had ever truly loved. Yet with every loss, affection curdled into unease. He began to see her not as comfort, but as a living reminder of the curse whispered through the palace corridors. The Tudors are doomed if they produce no sons. Between 1509, the year of their marriage, and 1520, Catherine bore at least 6 children. Only one survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born on the 18th of February, 1516. To Henry, Mary's survival was both blessing and torment. She was healthy, intelligent, and beloved, yet she was not a son. And in the Tudor mind, a realm without a male heir was a realm built on sand. Year after year, he watched his queen grow older, frailer, her prayers unanswered. He visited chapels, paid for masses, even wore relics of saints for protection. Still, the cradles remained empty. The air in the royal apartments thickened with tension. Courtiers whispered of divine displeasure, of a sin never confessed, that Henry had married his brother's widow, forbidden under Leviticus. Henry began to wonder if heaven itself was punishing him for it. By 1527, the king's faith in both Rome and his marriage had begun to fracture. He petitioned Pope Clement VII to annul his union, claiming that it was blighted in the eyes of God. The Pope refused. The reason was political, as much as theological. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and the Pope could not afford to offend him. Henry's frustration deepened into defiance. If Rome would not grant justice, he would create his own Rome. Step by step, act by act, he untied the knot that had bound England to the papacy for nearly 1,000 years. In 1533, the Act of Appeals declared that the English crown, not the Pope, held supreme authority over spiritual matters. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy named Henry as the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The break was complete. England had severed itself from the ancient heart of Christendom. Monasteries were dissolved, their stones sold, their treasures melted into coin. Over 800 religious houses were stripped within a decade. The wealth flowed into royal coffers, but faith itself fractured. The land that had once prayed in one voice now whispered in many Protestant, Catholic, Reformer, heretic, all under the same grey sky. In the wake of his new power came blood. Those who would not bend even old friends became enemies. Sir Thomas More, Henry's former counsellor and companion, refused to swear the oath acknowledging the king's supremacy. On the 6th of July, 1535, he was beheaded on Tower Hill, his final words a quiet declaration of conscience. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." The executions multiplied. 2 queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, followed the same path to the block. 6 marriages, 2 decapitations, 1 kingdom in turmoil. Yet beneath every act of fury, every decree written in crimson ink, pulsed the same wound that had opened decades earlier, the death of a 15-year-old boy in Ludlow Castle. That single loss had become a contagion of the soul. It had taught Henry that dynasties die when sons do not live, and that survival, in the end, might justify anything. From that fear came policies, and from policies came the unmaking of a faith, a continent, and countless lives. Looking back across the years, it is hard not to trace the line from the cold chamber in Ludlow to the roaring fires that consumed abbeys and libraries, from the boy who coughed his last beneath grey skies to the king who burned bridges to heaven. One death became a domino, and behind it history fell, toward Rome, toward the monasteries, toward every village chapel torn between prayer and silence. History sometimes turns not on wars or laws, but on a single moment of breath, a missed heartbeat that shifts the weight of centuries. And that moment, in England's story, bore a name carved into stone at Worcester: Arthur Tudor. When night descends on the old cathedrals, if one listens long enough, there are still sounds that do not belong to time. The faint hiss of a candle burning itself away, steady, patient, unstoppable. The sound of obsession at work. The sound of grief reshaping the fate of a kingdom. For 5 centuries after the death of Prince Arthur Tudor, historians have never ceased to argue over a single haunting question: what truly killed him? His passing at Ludlow Castle on the 2nd of April, 1502, ended a life scarcely begun and redirected the course of English history. Yet the cause of his death remains as veiled as the incense that once drifted above his coffin. The chroniclers of the time wrote in confusion. They described a sudden invisible terror, a corruption of the air, they called it, a foul mist that struck men down in the bloom of youth. Victims, they said, sweated until their very blood boiled in their veins. The heat consumed them faster than prayers could be spoken. The affliction came swiftly and left no trace but silence. The people named it the sweating sickness, a phrase simple and terrifying in equal measure. Between 1485 and 1551, 5 major outbreaks of the disease swept across England, claiming thousands. It spared neither noble nor peasant, cutting through palaces and villages alike. Some died within 3 hours of the first symptom. A chill, a shiver, then a sudden sweat that drenched the body. Physicians could do nothing. Remedies of the day were worse than useless. Bleeding, purging, prayers, and herbal poultices mixed in panic. The best advice offered was to lie still and do not stir. Few lived long enough to follow it. Arthur's own symptoms, as recorded by the attendants at Ludlow, matched those of the dreaded sweating sickness: fever, delirium, and profuse perspiration. Yet the disease's nature was so poorly understood that every diagnosis was guesswork. The medical science of the early 16th century had no concept of bacteria or viruses, no microscopes, no understanding of contagion. Physicians still believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and saw illness as a moral imbalance, a punishment, or a test. They reached for the only tools they had: the lancet, the leech, and the salter. Still, modern historians are divided. Some argue that the sweating sickness was indeed real, perhaps a form of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome spread by rodents. Others suspect pneumonia, or a highly virulent strain of influenza. In recent decades, a few researchers have even proposed a connection to the Henipavirus family, the same group that includes the deadly Nipah and Hendra viruses, though no evidence survives to confirm it. A smaller, more speculative school points to tuberculosis or testicular cancer, citing Arthur's reported frailty and pale complexion. Yet that last theory falters on one crucial detail. Catherine of Aragon, who shared his bed and fell ill at the same time, recovered fully. Whatever struck Ludlow in the spring of 1502, it was swift, cruel, and unrelenting. The royal physicians bled the prince to balance his humours, whispered prayers beside his bed, and burned herbs to cleanse the air. None of it mattered. The unseen force that invaded his body ignored every human attempt to reason with it. Within days, Arthur, a boy trained in Latin and kingship, a youth expected to heal a nation's divisions, was gone. And yet it is precisely the unknowability of his death that gives it such enduring power. A mystery without closure becomes more than a story. It becomes a mirror, reflecting each generation's fears. In the 16th century, it was divine wrath. In the 17th, a miasma. In the 19th, infection. In the 20th, a virus. Today, it remains all of them, and none. But the real contagion was not biological. It was psychological, and it infected an entire dynasty. From Arthur's death sprang Henry's terror of extinction, a wound that no crown could heal. The loss of a brother at 15 became, over time, the engine of a king's obsession. With heirs, with control, with the certainty that his bloodline must never die. The chain reaction was merciless. Arthur's death made Henry the heir. Henry's need for sons made him defy Rome. His defiance birthed the Church of England, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the blood-soaked decades that followed. 6 marriages, 2 executed queens, civil strife, and a nation torn between faiths all can be traced in one way or another back to that grey dawn at Ludlow when a candle guttered out beside a young prince's bed. Historians often speak of dominoes, of how one event, small and contained, tips the next and the next until a kingdom falls. In the story of England, that first domino was a coffin lowered into the earth in Worcester Cathedral, sealed beneath stone and silence. Had Arthur lived, the history of Europe might have bent along an entirely different arc. Henry VIII might have remained a younger son, perhaps a cardinal, a scholar, a patron of theology rather than its destroyer. There might have been no Anne Boleyn, no act of supremacy, no Reformation splintering the Western world. A single life, 15 years long, separated peace from centuries of division. The tomb at Ludlow holds no relics now, only echoes. Yet those echoes shape everything that came after. The Tudors rose upon a promise and ended upon its ruins, magnificent, radiant, and rotting beneath the gold. If one stands in the nave of Worcester at twilight, when the candles burn low and the air smells faintly of stone and wax, the silence seems alive. The hush of centuries still listening for the riddle no physician ever solved. The soft hiss of wax melting could be mistaken for breath, or for the whisper of history itself, the sound of a mystery that refused to die, and of a death that refused to end. In the year 2002, exactly 500 years after Prince Arthur Tudor drew his final breath in the cold chamber of Ludlow Castle, a quiet team of English archaeologists gathered inside Worcester Cathedral. They came not with shovels or spades, but with instruments of light devices capable of seeing through earth and stone. Their goal was to answer a question that had lingered for centuries. Where, truly, did England's lost prince rest? For generations, visitors had knelt before the elaborate stone monument that gleamed beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. A tomb carved with angels and saints, draped in Gothic tracery, its canopies climbing toward heaven. Most assumed that this was where Arthur lay, but local records and centuries of rumour whispered otherwise. The tomb, it seemed, was symbolic, not sepulchral, a cenotaph, not a coffin. The real burial, the documents hinted, was beneath the very floor, a few feet to the right of the monument, in a vault unseen by the world. Using ground-penetrating radar, the archaeologists swept the nave in slow, deliberate lines. The signals hummed through the stone and returned, faint and fractured, to the screen. Then, at a depth of several feet, a shape appeared. A narrow, rectangular cavity, sharply defined against the surrounding soil. Within that cavity lay a solid object, roughly the size and form of a coffin. The chamber was filled with soil, rubble, and what seemed to be traces of decayed timber. It matched the accounts from the early 16th century. Arthur's body, embalmed with spices and wrapped in linen, had been placed in a wooden chest, not a sarcophagus of stone. After 500 years, that wood had long since dissolved into the earth, its texture absorbed by the passage of centuries. What remained was an impression, a hollow echo of what once was, an outline where flesh and bone had merged with dust. The vault was not opened. English law forbids the disturbance of royal graves without explicit permission from the reigning monarch, and Queen Elizabeth II granted none. But the radar evidence was enough. The experts concluded with quiet certainty: Arthur still lies there. The boy who was meant to heal a fractured realm rests in silence, directly beneath the cathedral floor trodden by thousands who do not know his name. The small vault occupies the ground beneath a masterpiece of grief, the chantry chapel of Prince Arthur, commissioned by his father, King Henry VII, in 1504. The structure is carved of pale limestone, its buttresses crowned with finials, its canopy work delicate as lace. Each niche once held a saint or angel, their faces turned toward heaven in perpetual vigil. Within the chapel's eastern wall, tabernacle carvings, frames, slender columns and intricate canopies, stone filigree so refined it seems spun from breath. Time, however, has not been merciful. During the English Reformation, under the rule of King Edward VI, Henry VIII's only legitimate son, much of the sculpture was mutilated. The saints' faces were chiselled away, their hands, once raised in blessing, shattered. Yet remarkably, the chapel itself endured. The masons of destruction stopped short of its core, as though even zealotry hesitated before the tomb of a child. Today, when the afternoon sun filters through the stained glass, the light falls in colours across the flagstones: crimson, sapphire, and gold. It spills over the effigy of the prince carved not as a ruler, but as a sleeper, his hands folded in eternal prayer. Few of the visitors who drift through Worcester realise that a few metres below their feet lies the remnant of another England, a kingdom that never came to be. In that quiet corner of the cathedral, the air feels thicker, as though layered with unspoken memory. Guides still recite the names: Arthur, Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester. But the titles now sound less like honours than like elegies. He was, as one historian later wrote, the soul that missed the crown. The Henry VII chapel above him remains one of the finest examples of late medieval craftsmanship in England, a monument not only to a son, but to the idea of continuity itself. It was meant to declare victory over war and uncertainty, to say that the Tudors had endured. And yet, 5 centuries later, it feels like a contradiction carved in stone, a father's triumph built atop a child's grave. The radar images, now preserved in archives, show only a faint silhouette, a coffin-shaped void surrounded by packed earth. But in that void, one can read the outline of an entire alternate history. Had the prince inside lived, had the fever passed, had Catherine recovered beside him, the story of England might have turned upon a gentler axis. There would have been no shattering of altars, no breaking from Rome, no smoke rising from the abbeys of the realm. Instead, what endures is silence. The hush of centuries above a chamber never opened. When the cathedral empties and the last light fades, the air grows cool, and one can almost believe the stone remembers. Beneath its surface sleeps not just a boy, but a version of the world that never was an empire, that might have been kinder, steadier, perhaps even whole. And so Arthur Tudor remains, the prince who should have been king, resting in a darkness that no torch has disturbed since the reign of Henry VII. His marble likeness catches the coloured light. His true body dissolves in the soil below, and between them stretches 500 years of silence. The distance between what was and what might have been. Imagine, for a moment, that the chill of March in the year 1502 passed like an ordinary fever that Prince Arthur Tudor recovered, that Catherine of Aragon rose from her sickbed smiling, and that England awoke to spring without mourning. 7 years later, in 1509, the young prince, then 22, would have ascended the throne as King Arthur I of the House of Tudor. It is not difficult to picture him. He was quiet where his brother would be loud, reflective where others were rash. A boy raised on Latin and diplomacy, on theology and the art of measured thought, Arthur was described by his tutors as gentle in spirit and firm in reason. His letters to Catherine revealed a young man not yet hardened by power, but trained to wield it wisely. Under such a king, England might have found what it had long been denied: a century of peace without fracture. In this other history, Henry, 4 years younger, would never have worn a crown. As his father Henry VII once planned, he might have entered the church, perhaps rising to become Archbishop of York, a scholar and statesman in clerical robes. His brilliance would have been channeled into sermons, not edicts. His passion into theology, not tyranny. The Reformation, if it came at all, would have come softly, centuries later, born on reason rather than rage. A marriage between Arthur and Catherine would have sealed the bond between England and Spain, uniting two realms through faith and diplomacy. The alliance that began as strategy might have grown into affection, for both were pious, thoughtful, and equally devoted to learning. With Spain's fleets and England's growing trade, Europe could have faced a new axis of stability stretching from London to Granada. There might have been no need for wars with France, no papal excommunication, no flames consuming the abbeys and cloisters of the realm. In this imagined future, Thomas More would not have died upon Tower Hill. He might instead have served as a counsellor to King Arthur, drafting laws that blended faith and humanism. Erasmus of Rotterdam, his dear friend, would have continued to teach at Cambridge, spreading the principles of reason and virtue that were the flowering of the Renaissance. The English Church, still united with Rome, might have become a model of reform from within the gentle evolution of belief rather than its violent division. And what of the world beyond Europe? Without the English Reformation, there would have been no persecution of Puritans, no ships of exiles crossing the Atlantic in search of freedom. The Mayflower might never have sailed. The 13 colonies that became the United States of America might have remained, for centuries, the untamed lands of another empire. The very idea of the New World, as shaped by English Protestant settlers, would have been rewritten or erased. All of it, politics, religion, empire, rests upon a single breath, a fevered night in a chamber at Ludlow Castle. One prince's recovery would have changed not only England's crown but the trajectory of civilization itself. History, for all its vastness, can pivot on the life of a single body, on a pulse that continues or falters. Yet the word "if" has no place in the historian's lexicon. Arthur did not live. The sickness did not pass. Henry VIII did not become archbishop but king, and in his reign the fracture between body and soul, between church and state, between man and conscience, split open like the wound of his dynasty. The loss of one gentle prince birthed an age of iron and fire. Still, the ghost of what might have been lingers in Worcester Cathedral. Visitors who stand before the prince's tomb often whisper as though afraid to wake him. The inscription is simple: "Here lies Arthur, Prince of Wales." But the silence surrounding it carries an unspoken second line: "Here lies the world that never was." Some imagine that if he had lived, England would have remained whole, Rome unbroken, Europe steadier. Others suggest the opposite, that even peace, carried too long, breeds complacency, and that history requires the shock of rupture to renew itself. Perhaps the tragedy at Ludlow was not a mistake but a mechanism, the hinge on which the door of modernity turned. For if Arthur had lived, there might have been no Elizabeth I, no Shakespeare, no England forged in conflict and reborn in art. The Reformation, terrible though it was, shaped the English tongue, the Bible in common speech, the imagination of a people. In destroying, Henry also created. Still, It is hard not to linger on the other vision, a boy with hair like red gold, standing beside a Spanish queen, their hands joined over a map of a united Christendom. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral ring, not for coronations of conquest, but for continuance. The monasteries hum with prayer, their candles burning steadily, never torn from their walls. But history chose otherwise. The fever did not relent. The candles at Ludlow went out, and from that darkness rose a kingdom remade by obsession, faith, and flame. When pilgrims visit Worcester today, they still pause beside the carved effigy of the boy who never ruled. Some touch the stone lightly, as though in apology. Others simply whisper the same words that have lingered in England's memory for half a millennium. If the prince had lived, the world would be different. And yet perhaps it is the world, as it is now, that history intended all along, shaped not by mercy but by loss, not by peace, but by the silence that follows it. Sometimes, to move forward, history demands its first sacrifice. It is believed that the heart, or perhaps the preserved organs of Prince Arthur Tudor, lies buried in St. Lawrence's Church in Ludlow, the same market town where he took his final breath on the 2nd of April, 1502. The story says that when his body was prepared for transport to Worcester, the surgeons removed the internal organs, sealing them within a small chest. That chest, lined with lead and perfumed with cinnamon, cloves and frankincense, was laid beneath the floor of the parish church he had once attended as Prince of Wales. Today, a modest grey stone tablet marks the spot. Its inscription is brief and solemn. Here lies the heart of Arthur, Prince of Wales. No gold, no heraldic crest, no royal flourish, just words worn smooth by 5 centuries of hands that have traced them in quiet awe. Every year, pilgrims, schoolchildren, and antiquarians make the same small journey to Ludlow. They leave flowers, folded notes, sprigs of rosemary for remembrance. Some kneel, some only stand, but all are silent. Outside, the air still smells faintly of river and rain, of earth that remembers. Inside St. Lawrence's, light drifts down through coloured glass red and blue like old blood and sky. When the wind passes through the nave, it hums faintly against the stone, and for a moment it sounds like breath. The people who tend the church say that if one listens long enough, the organ pipes seem to echo the rhythm of a heartbeat, slow, even, ancient. 50 miles away, in Worcester Cathedral, the prince's body, or what remains of it, lies beneath the chantry chapel his father, King Henry VII, built in 1504. The limestone effigy above still shows a boy's face, calm and almost smiling, his hands joined in perpetual prayer. Across its surface, faint marks remain the scars of the Reformation, when zealots with chisels tried to erase saints from English stone. They never finished the work. Even in their fury, something restrained the final blow. The effigy endures, the face still gentle, the body still at peace. The ground beneath holds more than dust. Traces of the same aromatic resins used in his embalming cinnamon, clove, and frankincense linger in the soil, their molecules binding to the limestone. Under sunlight, the air sometimes thickens with drifting motes, and for a brief instant it seems as though the scents themselves rise to meet the light, mingling with the faint sweetness of time. Visitors pause without knowing why. They say the dust glows differently there, as though touched by something that has not fully left. Arthur has become a paradox, the prince who never reigned but never departed. His story belongs to the intersection of faith, politics, and the fragile machinery of human memory. Religion preserved him, politics killed him, and memory refuses to let him go. He is the hinge on which the Tudor myth turns the lost beginning that defines everything that followed. When one looks at the carved lettering of his titles, Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, they no longer read as positions of power, but as fragments of a prayer. Each name is an echo of what might have been. Each carries the weight of a crown that never touched his brow. The historian Polydore Virgil, writing in the early 16th century, called Arthur the promise of England's peace. That promise died at Ludlow, and yet, somehow, it still lingers. His death gave birth to Henry VIII, to the schism with Rome, to the upheaval of an age. But his memory, uncorrupted, unfulfilled, remains as England's unbroken dream. Every dynasty needs its ghost. The Tudors had Arthur. To his father, he was the hope that ended the Wars of the Roses. To his brother, the absence that would never stop echoing. To his people, the embodiment of innocence, untouched by power. Even now, his heart, real or symbolic, beats through the narratives that shaped the world, the need to believe that somewhere, beneath ruin and history, a pure beginning still rests. When sunlight filters through Worcester's stained glass, it casts red and gold upon the tomb, and in that moment, stone seems to breathe. Dust rises in slow spirals, soft and luminous, as though stirred by invisible motion. It is easy to imagine that Arthur is still there, not gone, merely changed. The Latin prayers he once recited still hang in the air, their syllables absorbed by stone. Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine. In that mingling of incense, dust and light, faith meets science, myth meets record. The prince's remains may have turned to earth, but his story persists, like the faint vibration after a bell has stopped ringing, an echo that travels through time itself. And so, more than 500 years later, people still come not for relics, but for reassurance. They stand on the stone above his resting place and feel, in the stillness, that history has a pulse, that some lives, though brief, continue indefinitely not as kings, but as questions. Arthur Tudor remains both boy and myth, both body and memory, both silence and song. And as the organ hums through the cathedral's ribs and the afternoon light fades to gold, one can almost hear him, the scholar prince, the gentle air whispering softly in Latin, reminding a restless world that peace, once promised, never fully dies. And now, as the echoes of history quiet, let us slow our steps. The story of Arthur Tudor, the boy who never ruled yet, never truly vanished, drifts away like candle smoke beneath the arches of Worcester Cathedral. The air grows still, and the centuries fold softly upon themselves. The bells have long stopped ringing. The footsteps of the mourners have faded, and only the hum of time remains. We have walked with him through battlefields, turned to memory, through fevered nights and whispered prayers, through stone corridors where light touches dust like a blessing. We have watched his heart lowered into the earth, and his name carved into marble so that no one would forget. And yet, more than a prince or a promise, Arthur has become something else, a quiet reminder of how fragile and luminous a single human life can be. History often roars, but here it exhales. It tells us that not every story of greatness ends in a crown, and not every life must conquer to be remembered. Sometimes, it is the ones who leave early, the ones whose voices were silenced before they could command, who teach us the gentlest truths. That peace, though broken, still has weight. That love, though interrupted, still leaves warmth behind. That even a short life, lived with grace, can echo for 500 years. In the calm that follows, imagine the cathedral at dusk, the stained glass dimming to grey, the last shafts of light bending through the air, and beneath it all, the faint shimmer of dust rising like spirit. Perhaps that is Arthur, or perhaps it is simply history breathing one more time before it sleeps. Either way, it feels peaceful. It feels enough. The story of Arthur Tudor is not only about what was lost, it is about what endures. The tenderness of remembrance, the resilience of hope, the strange beauty of impermanence. For every broken statue, there remains a pulse of compassion. For every faded page, a reader willing to turn it once more. So, as you close your eyes tonight, let the image soften. The stone, the candle, the boy beneath the earth. Let the sound of the organ fade into a hush, and carry with you the quiet message of his story, that history is not just the noise of kings and wars, but the whisper of hearts that still beat somewhere beneath the silence. May this lullaby of the past remind you that even endings can be gentle, that every loss, if remembered tenderly, becomes a kind of light. Sleep well, dear listener, and when morning comes, may you wake with a peaceful heart ready to wander again through the corridors of time, where the past still breathes and the stories never end. If this tale touched you, remember to like, subscribe, and stay close so together we can keep uncovering the hidden corners of history, one quiet heartbeat at a time.